The cherry red and cobalt blue lights of the patrol car pulsed in silence, painting the manicured boxwoods and the ridiculously perfect lawn in strokes of synthetic panic. Two officers stood on David Miller's porch, their expressions professionally neutral, their presence a screaming violation of the neighborhood's manufactured serenity. Between them stood Carol Jenkins, HOA president of Harmony Creek Estates, clutching a sheaf of papers to her chest like a holy text. The late afternoon sun glinted off the rhinestones on her glasses, tiny, merciless stars. A breeze rustled the crepe myrtle by the walkway, carrying the scent of cut grass and something acrid, like burnt plastic. "This is an official order from the county court, Mr. Miller," Carol said, her voice a triumphant quaver. She pushed a document forward, the paper trembling slightly in her manicured hand. "It's an emergency eviction notice. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises." David didn't look at the paper. He didn't look at the cops. His gaze drifted past Carol's smug, powdered face to his neighbor's mailbox across the street. The brass number 4 was slightly crooked, a tiny imperfection in Carol's curated kingdom. A flaw she had somehow missed in her daily patrols. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched David's lips as his mind cataloged the error. It was the smile of a demolitions expert who sees the one hairline fracture in the dam right before it bursts. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of her illegal HOA takedown. "Where are you watching from? Comment your city now. I want to see just how far this kind of HOA power reaches." 3 months earlier, that same porch had been a sanctuary. David, a retired Army intelligence analyst, had bought the house in Harmony Creek for its quiet stability. It was a place where his 15-year-old son, Leo, could have a normal life, far from the transient existence of military bases. The air, here in this slice of North Carolina suburbia, was thick with the smell of pine straw and blooming gardenias, a peaceful perfume that promised cookouts and quiet evenings. David had spent 2 decades deconstructing networks of insurgents. He figured he could handle the complexities of lawn maintenance schedules. The illusion of peace began to crumble on a Tuesday with a letter. It arrived in a crisp, cream-colored envelope, the HOA's pretentious crest embossed in gold. Inside, a single sheet of heavy cardstock informed him that his welcome mat, a simple black rubber rectangle that said nothing at all, was in violation of Article 4, Section 8B of the Community Bylaws. The approved color palette for all exterior entryway floor coverings was earth tones, a list of which was helpfully attached. His mat was designated void black. A fine of $50 had been levied against his account. Leo peered over his shoulder, a half-eaten apple in his hand. The crunching sound filled the sudden tense silence in the kitchen. "A fine? For a doormat? Is that even a real thing?" David felt the old instinct stir, the familiar prickle of a system being tested. In Afghanistan, he'd learned that the first move an enemy makes is always a probe, designed to measure your response. He didn't get angry. He got organized. He sat down at his computer, the hum of the hard drive a comforting sound, and pulled up the digital copy of the Harmony Creek CCNRs, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions. All 278 pages of them. He poured a cup of black coffee, the bitter aroma filling the air around his desk, and began to read. "If you've ever been bullied by an HOA, you're going to love this ending. Stick with me." It took him 45 minutes. There, buried on page 94, was the first piece of ammunition he would need. He highlighted the text, a cold satisfaction settling in his gut. He printed the page, slipped it into an envelope, and walked across the street to Carol Jenkins's immaculate beige house. She answered the door wearing a pink velour tracksuit, a tiny, fluffy white dog yapping at her heels. Her home smelled intensely of potpourri and lemon-scented polish, a chemical sweetness that clung to the back of the throat. "David," she said, her smile tight and thin. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" He handed her the envelope. "Carol, I received your notice about my welcome mat." He kept his voice level, devoid of emotion. It was a tone he'd perfected in debriefings. "I believe there's been a procedural error." She arched a perfectly plucked eyebrow. "The board is very clear on aesthetic violations, David." "I'm sure it is," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "But according to Article 9, Section 3, Any first-time aesthetic violation requires a written warning and a 30-day cure period for the homeowner to rectify the issue before any fine can be legally levied. You levied the fine immediately. That action is a direct violation of the bylaws you're supposed to be enforcing. This was his first knowledge bomb. A small tactical strike. He saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes, quickly masked by indignation. The little dog yapped louder, a frantic, tiny alarm. She had expected him to roll over, to write the check, to buy a beige mat. She had not expected him to have read the rules of engagement better than she had. Well, she sputtered, straightening her tracksuit jacket. That's a minor technicality. There are no technicalities in contracts, Carol, only terms, David said, turning to leave. I'll expect a letter of retraction for the fine by the end of the day. He walked away without waiting for a response, the sound of the yapping dog fading behind him. He knew this wasn't a victory. It was a declaration of war. He had just painted a target on his own back. What would you have done in my place? Drop your answer in the comments below. The retaliation was petty, and it came swiftly. 2 days later, another cream envelope. This time, the violation was for excessive noise. Leo had been in his room practicing his electric guitar. He was wearing high-end, noise-canceling headphones, the same kind David used at the shooting range. The guitar wasn't even plugged into an amplifier. The only sound was the faint, tinny plink, plink, plink of unplugged metal strings, a sound quieter than the cicadas buzzing in the pine trees. David stood in his son's doorway, watching him play. The passion on Leo's face, the way his fingers danced over the frets. It was the one thing that truly made his son come alive. How could she have heard it? Then he saw it. Through Leo's window, across the manicured lawns, was Carol Jenkins's house. Her pristine home office window had a direct line of sight into his son's bedroom. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. She was watching them. The scent of pine and freshly mown grass suddenly felt cloying, the air thick with surveillance. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about control. This was a psychological operation. Dad, everything okay? Leo asked, pulling off his headphones. The sudden silence was heavy. Everything's fine, son, David said, forcing a smile. Just change of plans. We're going on that camping trip this weekend. Let's get out of here, for a couple of days. They left that Friday, heading for the Blue Ridge Mountains. They hiked until their legs ached, cooked bacon and eggs over a crackling fire that smelled of oak and hickory, and slept under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed to hum. For 48 hours, the oppressive perfection of Harmony Creek was a distant memory. They returned Sunday evening, tired and happy, the truck smelling of campfire smoke, pine needles, and the rich, dark earth of the mountains. The first sign that something was wrong was the front door. It was unlocked. David knew, with the certainty of a man whose life once depended on such details, that he had locked it. He always performed a 3-point check. Front door, back door, garage. Always. He put a hand on Leo's chest, stopping him on the porch. Wait here, he whispered. The old training flooded back, his senses sharpening to a razor's edge. He pushed the door open slowly. The house was silent, but the air was different. The familiar scent of their home, clean laundry, old books, whatever Leo had last cooked in the microwave, was contaminated. Underneath it was a faint, cloying floral scent. Rose and vanilla. Carol's perfume. He swept the house room by room. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. Then he saw it, placed dead center on the gleaming granite of the kitchen island. A cream-colored envelope. His heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure rage. He picked it up. Inside was not a fine but a smarmy typed note. David, I noticed your mail was piling up and became concerned for your welfare. As part of my community watch duties, I performed a wellness check and was relieved to find the house empty. However, I did notice a thin layer of dust on your fireplace mantel. See Article Fee, Section 2, Interior Cleanliness Standards visible from exterior. Please rectify this at your earliest convenience. Yours in community, Carol Jenkins, HOA President. She had used a master key, an HOA-held key for emergencies only, fires, floods, police actions, not for dust inspection. She had invaded his home, his sanctuary, The one place on Earth he and his son were supposed to be safe. It was a flagrant, illegal abuse of power. The paper felt slick in his hand, an oily residue of her presence coating the expensive cardstock. He could still smell her perfume, ghostly presence in his clean house. "This isn't just my fight. It's yours too. Tell me if your HOA has ever crossed this line." Leo came in, his face a mask of confusion and fear. "Dad, what's going on? Why'd you have me wait?" He saw the note in his father's hand, the look in his eyes. David crumpled the paper into a tight ball, the thick cardstock crackling in protest. The controlled calm he had maintained for weeks finally fractured, revealing the cold fury beneath. This was no longer a series of petty skirmishes over bylaws. This was a home invasion. And in David's world, you didn't just defend against an invasion. You dismantled the enemy's entire operational capability. "She came in the house, Leo," David said, his voice dangerously quiet. "While we were gone, she let herself in." Leo's face went from scared to white-hot anger. "She what? That's illegal. We should call the cops." "We will," David said, the analyst in his mind already running threat assessments and strategy matrices. "But not yet. The police will call it a civil dispute between a homeowner and an overzealous HOA. A slap on the wrist. No, we're not going to file a complaint. We're going to build a case. We're going to conduct an operation." That night, father and son transformed their home into a fortress. It wasn't just about security. It was about intelligence gathering. Leo, a prodigy with code and circuitry, took the lead. They didn't just buy a standard security system from a big-box store. They built a network. They installed micro cameras, no bigger than a screw head, covering every exterior angle of the house. They put motion sensors on the lawn, pressure sensors under the welcome mat, the new HOA-approved beige one, and audio recorders near the windows. It was a digital minefield, but Leo had a special project for the inside. "She feels entitled to come in here, Dad," he said, his fingers flying across a keyboard as he configured a series of servers in his closet. The blue light from the monitor cast his face in a determined glow. "So, let's give her a reason to. Let's create a little honey trap." For the next week, the house was quiet. David paid his dues, mowed his lawn to the regulation height, and gave Carol a polite, empty wave whenever he saw her patrolling in her golf cart. He was playing the part of the compliant resident. Lulling the enemy into a false sense of security was phase one of any successful counterintelligence op. He could feel her watching, waiting for her next opportunity, her next excuse to exert her power. He was counting on it. If you think HOAs should be held accountable for this kind of scandal, type "yes" in the comments so we can get this story trending. The alert came just after midnight, a week later. David was in his study, poring over North Carolina property law, when his phone buzzed with a silent custom notification Leo had programmed. It didn't make a sound, just a specific vibration pattern. Perimeter breach. Garage side door. He tapped the screen. A live feed flickered to life, displayed in crisp night vision. The camera was hidden inside an old smoke detector on the garage ceiling. The image showed the side door swinging open. A figure slipped inside, cloaked in the gray-green wash of the infrared camera. It was Carol. She moved with a practiced stealth that was genuinely chilling, closing the door behind her without a sound. The air in the garage was cool and smelled of gasoline and old paint. She stood for a moment, listening. Then she pulled a can of spray paint from the oversized canvas bag she carried. Red. A garish, violent color. David's heart hammered in his chest, a mix of adrenaline and vindication. "I have you." Carol moved toward his classic 1969 Mustang, a car he and his father had restored together. It was his one prized possession, a gleaming monument of steel and memory. She raised the can. But then she stopped. Her head tilted, as if she heard something. She scanned the garage, her eyes moving methodically. David's training screamed at him. She was a former military brat, or maybe a cop's wife. She knew how to look for things that were out of place. Her gaze swept past the workbench, the lawnmower, the stacked boxes. It settled on the smoke detector. For a terrifying second, she stared directly at the lens. David could see the glint in her eye, the subtle shift in her expression from predator to something else. Something calculating. Then she smiled. It was a cold, reptilian grin, a smile that knew it was being watched and didn't care. It was a smile that said, "You see me, but you can't prove a thing." She raised the spray paint can, not at the car, but aimed it directly at the camera lens. The feed filled with a burst of red static, and then a horrifying final blackness. The connection was severed. She hadn't just trespassed, she had found his camera and destroyed his evidence, turning his own trap against him. And she was still inside his house. The black screen on his phone was a void, a digital grave. For a split second, the world compressed into the silent, suffocating space of the garage on the other side of the wall. She was in there, with his car, with his memories. The primitive urge to charge in, to physically expel the threat, surged through him, hot and blinding. But 20 years of training smothered the impulse like a wet blanket on a fire. A direct confrontation was an amateur's move. It's what she wanted. A scene, a shouting match, an excuse to play the victim. He was not an amateur. David's fingers moved, swiping to another app Leo had designed. It was a simple audio monitor, linked to a micro-recorder hidden in a box of old spark plugs on the workbench. He pressed his phone to his ear. He heard the rustle of her canvas bag, the soft scuff of her orthopedic sneakers on the concrete floor. He heard the distinct metallic thunk of the spray paint can being set down. Then, the almost silent snick of the side door latch. And then, nothing. She was gone. He waited a full 5 minutes, his body coiled as tightly as a spring, before he moved. He walked through the house, the scent of her phantom perfume still irritating his nostrils, and entered the garage. The air was thick with the chemical tang of fresh paint. A single taunting stripe of crimson marred the gray concrete floor, an arrogant slash of red pointing from the side door toward his Mustang. The car itself was untouched. The smoke detector on the ceiling was caked in the same obscene red. It wasn't vandalism. It was a message. I can get to you anytime I want, and your silly little toys can't stop me. Leo appeared in the doorway behind him, his face pale in the dim light. She really did it. David ran a hand over his face, the rough scrape of his stubble a grounding sensation. She didn't come here to paint the car, Leo. She came here to destroy the camera. She knew, or she suspected. This is an escalation. He looked at his son, whose anger had been replaced by a quiet, simmering fear. She's not trying to win an argument anymore. She's trying to make us run. What they did next almost made me lose everything, but it also gave me the win of my life. The next phase of Carol's campaign began not with a letter, but with a whisper. She took the war to the digital front, the Harmony Creek Community Facebook group. The first post was subtle, a vague warning about new residents who don't respect our community values. Then came the comments from her loyalists. I heard he was discharged from the military for psychological issues. A lie. His son's music is so loud, it rattles my dentures. Impossible. Then her own comment, dripping with faux concern. Let's all be patient. Adjusting to civilian life can be difficult. We should offer our support, not our judgment. She was painting him as unstable, a ticking time bomb in their peaceful suburban paradise. The digital poison seeped into the real world. The friendly waves from neighbors became clipped nods. The casual hellos at the mailbox ceased. They were being socially isolated, boxed in. It was a classic counterinsurgency tactic. Win the hearts and minds of the populace, and the enemy has nowhere to hide. Then came the barrage. On Monday, a $500 fine appeared, slid under their front door. The violation: unauthorized landscape ornamentation. Leo had painted a small garden gnome to look like a punk rocker and placed it among the azaleas. On Tuesday, a certified letter arrived from the HOA's law firm, a name partner at one of the most powerful firms in the state. It was a formal notice of intent to place a lien on their property for unpaid fines, which had now, with administrative fees, mysteriously ballooned to over $2,000. The paper felt heavy, important, the words a dense forest of legal threats. Wednesday was the masterstroke. A gleaming white truck from the city's code enforcement division pulled up to the curb. A man with a clipboard and a sour expression spent an hour in David's backyard, using a rolling measuring wheel to check the setback of his fence from the property line. David watched from the kitchen window, the bitter taste of cold coffee on his tongue. He knew the fence was compliant. He'd measured it himself before he bought the house. But the message was clear. Carol's husband, the city councilman, had been activated. She wasn't just using the HOA's power anymore. She was weaponizing the city itself. That night, David knew his strategy had to change. He had been on defense, reacting to her moves. It was time to go on the offensive. He cleared the kitchen table, brewed a fresh pot of coffee that filled the air with its dark, earthy scent, and opened his laptop. He wasn't a homeowner anymore. He was an analyst, and Carol Jenkins was his target. He began building a file, a complete intelligence workup. He scoured public records, property deeds, campaign finance reports for her husband, and years of archived community newsletters. He treated the Harmony Creek HOA as a hostile network, mapping its leadership, its assets, and its command structure. He was looking for a weakness, a vulnerability. His first breakthrough came from an unlikely source. He'd noticed old Mr. Henderson, a widower who lived in the corner house, meticulously scrubbing green algae from his bird bath every single morning. This week, a small pile of cream-colored envelopes had appeared on the table next to his front door. David walked over, ostensibly to borrow a cup of sugar. Mr. Henderson, a man with skin like wrinkled parchment and eyes that had seen too much, was initially terrified. "I can't talk to you, son," he whispered, his hands trembling as he polished a pair of binoculars. "She sees everything." David softened his voice. "I'm not asking you to fight, sir. I'm just asking for information. She's fining you for the bird bath, isn't she?" The old man's shoulders slumped. "Every week, $50. Says it attracts avian vagrants. I've lived here for 30 years. My Mary loved those birds." He looked away, his eyes glassy. It all changed when Carol took over the board 3 years ago. Right after that business with the developers' reserve funds went sideways. That was it. The breadcrumb. The developers' reserve funds. David spent the entire night diving down a rabbit hole of county clerk records and state business filings. The keystrokes on his laptop were the only sound in the dark house. And then, at 3:17 a.m., he found it. The second, and far more powerful, knowledge bomb. It wasn't just a bylaw violation. It was the key to the entire kingdom. According to the North Carolina Secretary of State website, every nonprofit corporation, which an HOA is, must file an annual report to remain in good standing. It was a simple, procedural task. But David, scrolling through the corporate history of the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association, Inc., saw a glaring red flag. They had missed their filing deadline. Not just for this year, but for the year before, as well. And according to state statute per 55A-14-20, failure to file for 2 consecutive years results in automatic administrative dissolution. The blood rushed in his ears. He read it again. It meant the Harmony Creek HOA, as a legal corporate entity, did not exist. It had been dissolved by the state. Every fine they had issued, every threat they had made, every letter their high-priced lawyers had sent for the past 24 months had been sent by a ghost, a defunct organization with no more legal authority than a neighborhood book club. He felt a surge of triumph so powerful, it almost made him dizzy. This was the weapon that could end the entire scandal. The quarterly HOA meeting was the perfect battlefield. It was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and burnt coffee. David walked in and sat in the back, the crisp printouts from the Secretary of State's website feeling like a dagger hidden in his jacket. Carol, perched at the head table, ran the meeting with an iron fist, her voice cutting through any dissent. When she finally opened the floor for new business, David stood up. "Madam President," he began, his voice calm and clear, echoing slightly in the tense room. "David Miller, 412 Dogwood Lane. I have a point of order regarding the board's legal authority to conduct this meeting." A ripple of murmurs went through the 24 residents in attendance. Carol's eyes narrowed. "Your point, Mr. Miller." David walked to the front of the room and placed a paper on the overhead projector. It was the screenshot from the state website, The words, dissolved by Secretary of State, in stark black and white. My point, David said, his voice ringing with authority, is that according to the state of North Carolina, the Harmony Creek HOA was administratively dissolved 2 years ago for failure to file its annual reports. As of this moment, this board has no legal authority to levy fines, enforce covenants, or even hold this meeting. Every action you have taken for the past 2 years has been, legally speaking, fraudulent. The room exploded. Shouts of anger and confusion erupted. People who had been fined for their trash cans, their basketball hoops, their flower beds, were on their feet, yelling at the board. Mr. Henderson was staring, his mouth agape. It was a full-blown insurrection. Carol's face went from chalk white to a blotchy, furious red. Her husband, Councilman Jenkins, who had been observing from the back wall, was already on his phone, his face grim. This meeting is adjourned, Carol shrieked, banging her gavel so hard the plastic base cracked. This is a lie, a slanderous attack. David felt a surge of victory. He had done it. He had exposed her. He had cut the head off the snake. Ever dealt with an HOA bully? Let's see how many of us there are. The victory lasted less than 12 hours. The next morning, fueled by a renewed sense of hope, David checked the Secretary of State's website, again, planning to print out more copies for his neighbors. His heart sank into his stomach. The damning red, dissolved notice was gone. In its place, in clean black letters, were the words, current status, active, and in good standing. Someone, Councilman Jenkins no doubt, had pulled strings, called in favors, and not only fast-tracked the reinstatement paperwork, but had gotten the state to backdate the filing. In the eyes of the law, his silver bullet had vanished. His triumph had been erased overnight. It had been a false summit, and now he was more exposed than ever. The retaliation was no longer a skirmish. It was an airstrike. Carol, publicly humiliated and stripped of her veneer of legitimacy, was now fighting for her survival. She couldn't let his challenge stand. She convened an emergency, closed-door session of the executive board. David learned later from Mr. Henderson, who heard it from another board member's guilt-ridden wife, what had happened. Carol, in a rage, had fabricated a narrative. She claimed David was a dangerous dissident, that his slanderous attack at the meeting was proof of his intent to harm the community, and that his mountain of fines, the welcome mat, the gnome, the guitar, were evidence of his refusal to comply with the rules that kept them all safe. Citing a rarely used clause in the bylaws about protecting the community from nuisance homeowners, she and her 2 cronies on the 3-person board voted unanimously. They voted to authorize their lawyers to begin foreclosure proceedings on his home. The next 60 seconds of this story will show you exactly how a single document can destroy an entire HOA. A week later, the official notice arrived. It wasn't a cream-colored envelope this time. It was a thick, terrifying packet delivered by a court process server. The legalese was impenetrable, a wall of text designed to intimidate and confuse. But the words he could understand were sledgehammers to the gut, notice of default, acceleration of debt, judicial foreclosure. This was it, the document from the cold open. This was the eviction notice, backed by the full weight of her husband's political machine and their high-powered law firm. He sat in the dark of his study, the papers spread out before him like the scene of an accident. The weight of it all pressed down on him, the feeling of being outmaneuvered, outgunned. He called the most respected property lawyer in the county, a man whose website promised he was a bulldog for homeowners. The lawyer listened patiently to the entire story, from the welcome mat to the dissolved corporation to the foreclosure. A long, weary sigh came through the phone. "Mr. Miller," the lawyer said, his voice heavy with resignation, "I believe every word you've told me, and you are 100% in the right, morally. But legally, you're in a tough spot. They've papered your file with violations. They've documented everything. A judge isn't going to look at the backstory. They're going to see a homeowner who has refused to pay his dues and fines, and an HOA that is, on paper, following its own procedures for foreclosure. It's your word against their mountain of evidence. Fighting this will cost you tens of thousands of dollars you may never get back. Honestly, they have you cornered." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. David's training, his analytical mind, His belief that systems had rules that could be used to win, it all crumbled. He was facing a system that was rigged from the inside. Just then, his phone buzzed. The caller ID read, Carol Jenkins. He stared at it for a moment, then answered, putting it on speaker. Her voice, dripping with a venomous, syrupy sweetness, filled the silent room. Hello, David. I trust you received our little delivery today? David said nothing. You see, this is what happens when you don't know your place, she continued, savoring every word. You thought you were so clever with your little stunt at the meeting, but you're not in the army anymore. You're in my world now, and in my world, I make the rules. There was a pause, and he could practically hear the smirk in her voice. Checkmate. She hung up. The dial tone buzzed, a monotonous, mocking sound. He sat there, the foreclosure notice under his hand, the lawyer's defeated words echoing in his ears, and Carol's triumphant declaration sealing his fate. He was trapped, cornered. He had lost. The dial tone's monotonous buzz was the sound of absolute defeat. David sat motionless in his study, the foreclosure notice a dead weight, under his hand. Each perfectly typed word was a brick in the wall closing in around him. He had fought a battle of wits and rules, only to find the enemy was the one writing them. Carol's smug, victorious voice echoed in the silence. Checkmate. He felt the crushing pressure of failure, not for himself, but for his son. He had brought Leo here for stability, and instead had dragged him into a war zone where their very home was the price of losing. Leo came and stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hall. He didn't say anything, just watched his father. David finally looked up, the exhaustion in his eyes more profound than any fatigue from his years in the military. She won, Leo, he said, his voice a rough, quiet rasp. My lawyer says we can't beat them in court. They've built a perfect case on a foundation of lies. He pushed the papers across the desk. We should probably start looking for a new place. I'm sorry, I failed you. Leo walked into the room, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at the foreclosure notice. He looked at his father's laptop. You taught me to never engage an enemy on their chosen ground, Leo said, his voice steady, devoid of the panic David felt. The court is her ground. This house is ours. It's not a metaphor, son. It's a legal filing. They're taking the house. No, they're not, Leo said, pulling up a chair. He plugged a small black external hard drive into the laptop. The quiet whir of the drive spinning up was the only sound. When she spray-painted the camera, she thought she won. She thought she destroyed the evidence. But she only destroyed the lens. David frowned. The feed cut out. There's nothing there. The video feed cut out, Leo corrected him, his fingers flying across the keyboard, typing lines of code into a command prompt. But the audio recorder in the Spark plug box kept running on its own battery for another 90 seconds. She thought she was alone. He hit enter. A waveform appeared on the screen. Leo clicked play. The sound of hissing spray paint filled the room, followed by the clatter of the can on concrete. Then, Carol's voice, a low, hateful mutter, not meant for anyone's ears. That'll teach the smug bastard, she whispered. Think you can look into my business? Nobody looks at the reserve funds. Nobody. It's my money now. David's blood ran cold. The reserve funds. The breadcrumb from Mr. Henderson. It wasn't just about power. It was about money. But a mumbled recording wasn't enough, and there's more, Leo said, a flicker of a triumphant smile on his face. She was so busy being a spy, she never thought anyone would be spying on her. The clubhouse has free community Wi-Fi. The router they use is ancient. The security is a joke. I wasn't trying to hack them, just monitor network traffic for any emails she sent about us. I wanted to prove the harassment. He opened a folder on the hard drive. It was filled with thousands of captured data packets. Turns out, she does all of her HOA and personal banking on that unsecured network. For the next 2 hours, they worked, father and son, not as victims, but as a two-man intelligence unit. David's analytical mind paired with Leo's digital fluency. They pieced together the fragments, reassembled deleted files, and cracked poorly encrypted financial statements. What they found was staggering. It was a clear-cut case of embezzlement, hiding in plain sight. 3 years prior, just before his first run for city council. Carol's husband was broke. In an email chain between their private accounts, they laid out a plan. Carol, as the newly elected HOA president, would authorize a $75,000 payment from the community's capital reserve fund, money legally earmarked for major repairs like paving roads and replacing roofs, to a shell corporation for asphalt resurfacing consultation. The corporation was a ghost, its address a P.O. box. The money was then wired from that corporation's account directly into her husband's campaign fund. They had stolen from their neighbors to buy a seat on the city council. The crime wasn't just the theft, it was the arrogance, the absolute certainty they would never be caught. David leaned back, the musty smell of old paper from his research files mixing with the electric hum of the computer. He finally had her. This wasn't about a bylaw. This was a felony. But going to the police was risky. Her husband had connections. The evidence could get buried, spun, or dismissed. He needed to neutralize her completely, and that meant taking away her power base first. He turned back to his research, but this time he wasn't looking at HOA bylaws. He was looking for the source code, the original documents that gave the HOA its power. He found it in the county's digital archives, the 1988 Master Declaration of Covenants, the master document filed by the original developer that governed everything. He read through the dense legalese until his eyes burned. And then, on the final page, in a section titled Dissolution of Board, he found the kill switch. This was the third and final knowledge bomb. The clause stated that the board served at the pleasure of the homeowners. In cases of proven gross negligence or criminal financial malfeasance, the standard rules for removing board members were void. A petition signed by just 25% of homeowners could force an immediate emergency community meeting. At that meeting, a simple majority vote was all that was required to dissolve the entire board and elect an interim replacement. She had built her kingdom on a foundation of sand, and he had just found the earthquake machine. Your story could be next. Comment your HOA horror below and I might cover it. The plan was audacious. David typed up a simple one-page summary of the financial evidence. No jargon, just the damning numbers and the email quotes. He attached a copy of the petition. He and Leo spent the next day walking the neighborhood. They didn't go to Carol's loyalists. They went to the quiet ones, the ones who kept their heads down. To Mr. Henderson, who signed with a trembling, defiant hand. To the young family fined because their toddler's plastic slide was the wrong shade of primary blue. To the woman forced to dig up her prize-winning petunias because they weren't on the approved floral list. With each signature, the story spread. Fear gave way to a simmering rage. By sunset, they had signatures from over 60% of the homeowners. He filed the petition legally with the HOA's secretary, forcing the emergency meeting. Carol had no choice but to comply. The meeting was set for Thursday night. The battlefield was chosen. The trap was set. The clubhouse was packed. Every seat was taken, and people stood 3 deep along the walls. The air, usually stale with the scent of cheap coffee, was electric with tension. Carol and her 2 crony board members sat at the head table, their faces tight with forced composure. She opened the meeting with a condescending speech about malicious rumors and disgruntled residents. David let her talk. He let her dig her own grave. Then, as per the rules of the meeting he had called, he took the floor. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He spoke like the analyst he was, laying out a calm, chronological case. For the past 3 years, he began, this community has been told we need to make sacrifices, that our dues must go up to cover rising costs. We have been fined and threatened for the smallest of infractions, all in the name of fiscal responsibility. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then he gestured to a projector screen Leo had set up. This is where our money has gone. The first image was a copy of the bank transfer from the HOA reserve account to the Shell Corporation. The next was the transfer from the Shell Corporation to the Jenkins for Council campaign fund. Gasps rippled through the room. He then displayed the emails, blown up for all to see, with the incriminating phrases highlighted in yellow. Carol leaped to her feet. This is outrageous. These are forgeries. This man is a liar who is angry about being foreclosed on for his own failures to follow the rules. David looked at her, his expression unpitying. Is it a forgery, Carol? Or is it just the truth you never wanted anyone to see? He then played the audio file. Her own voice, thin and wretched, filled the room. Nobody looks at the reserve. Funds. Nobody. It's my money now. The silence that followed was absolute, a crushing weight of shock and betrayal. Every eye in the room was on Carol, whose face had crumpled into a mask of pure horror. Her husband, standing in the back, looked like he was about to be physically ill. A woman in the front row, a CPA who had lived in Harmony Creek for 20 years, stood up. I've reviewed the documents Mr. Miller circulated with his petition, she said, her voice shaking with rage. Those bank statements are real. This is grand larceny. That was the spark. The room erupted. The carefully constructed facade of Carol's authority shattered into a million pieces. People were on their feet, shouting, pointing. The anger was a physical force, a wave of pure community outrage directed at the woman who had bullied and stolen from them for years. I invoke Article F, Section 4 of the Master Declaration. David's voice cut through the chaos. I call for an immediate vote of no confidence and the dissolution of the current board. Mr. Henderson, his voice frail but clear, seconded the motion. The vote was a roar of aye that shook the flimsy walls of the clubhouse. It was over. Her reign was over. As Carol stood there, stunned and speechless, the main doors of the clubhouse swung open. 2 uniformed police officers and 2 plainclothes detectives stepped inside. They were followed by David's lawyer, who held a thick file containing all of Leo's evidence. One of the detectives approached the head table, his eyes locked on Carol and her husband. Carol Jenkins? Councilman Jenkins? The detective said, his voice calm but unforgiving. We have a warrant to seize all financial records of the Harmony Creek HOA, and we have a few questions for you down at the station. Regarding financial misappropriation, the final perfect image of the night was the look on Carol's face, not of anger, but of utter, blank shock as she was stripped of her power, her status, and her freedom in the very room that had been the seat of her tiny, tyrannical empire. Her savage payback wasn't just losing, it was being dismantled by the very people she despised. 2 months later, David and Leo sat on their front porch. The air was cool and carried the sweet, earthy scent of approaching autumn. A new HOA board had been elected, with Mr. Henderson as the surprisingly strict but fair-minded treasurer. All of David's fines had been expunged, and the foreclosure action was a dead and buried memory. The local paper had run a series of articles on the scandal, leading to the councilman's indictment and the unraveling of a larger network of small-town corruption. The community was healing. Neighbors were talking again. Someone had even painted a mural on the clubhouse wall. David looked across the street at his neighbor's mailbox. The brass number 4 was still crooked. He smiled. It wasn't a flaw anymore. It was just a part of the landscape, a tiny, welcome imperfection in a world that was finally, genuinely, at peace. You know, Leo said, nudging his dad's arm, I think my punk rock gnome would look really good next to Mr. Henderson's birdbath. David laughed, a real, deep laugh that felt like it had been trapped inside him for months. He had fought for his home, but he had won back something more, a community, and the simple, profound right to be left alone. He had learned that justice isn't always found in a courtroom. Sometimes, it's found in the fine print, in the courage of a quiet neighbor, and in the digital ghost of a tyrant's own whispered words. If you believe that no one is above the law, hit that subscribe button so we can take down every corrupt HOA together. Like, share, and tag a friend who needs to see that when they push you, you can push back harder. The more people who know these stories, the harder it is for bullies like Carol Jenkins to get away with it.